So now we're 11 years old at the space, about 10 minutes away, and we, still on average have about 60 people in the collective, doing weekly shifts, doing offsite events, doing some administrative role. In 2020, one of the collective members passed away from COVID, but right before he went on a ventilator, he called me to tell me how to access his, one-bedroom apartment and his 4 storage units full of books and records. And then, about 4 years ago, we started the process, his friends from Word Up, slowly moving all of those items to this space. This space had been empty for almost 20 years, and it turned into, a sea of boxes for a few months. And you could see on some of those boxes and books people's names on Post-its, people that he meant to recirculate these things to, people we knew who didn't know that he'd been collecting, this and that for him. So we had the door open, COVID numbers were rising again, and people were trying to look, had those nervous energy and needed something to do, so they'd come in and they'd say, what's going on in here? And they started helping us make aisles, and, and we said, take this stuff, pay what you can. And so that's how recirculation was born. It's still, 99% used books, pay what you can. We host most of our events here now, still some at Word Up as well. But, most of all, we want to recirculate not just these items, and many more than books, much more than just books that are recirculated here, but also the space itself. So if there are things that you want to do here, or that someone else needs a space for, then we really do invite you to, stretch the bounds of what can happen with the space that we can all share. Because of that history and everything that has forced all of us in the Word Up Collective to think about over all of these 13 years, it's really exciting and gratifying to then, end up having to, be in contact with and have to engage with a book that suddenly feels like, it makes sense. There's a lot about Gabrielle, Bendiner, Viani's work that through the Buscata studio and in some of the work of another book that she worked on, Contested City, that won prizes, and all of the work she's done in different neighborhoods over the years that some people know about, I can tell you about. But the thing that I really want to tell you about is that I had been accidentally a fan of Gabrielle without knowing Gabrielle, because you see something on the internet that you like, you're like, oh, who made this? As a nonprofit-y person or a collective person, or you look at the credits and you look at the acknowledgements, and I was like, oh, okay. And I remembered the name, and then you go down a rabbit hole and you find other things and you like those too, and you realize, oh, I've seen that name before. And then I had this whole body of tabs up in my browser of things that I was a fan of Gabrielle's, and not realizing that you'd been at Word Up before and been at events, and that I'd seen you before too. So I was really also especially excited as a fangirl to finally meet you, and then to read the book and then realize that there's even so much more that I feel very connected to. I mean, some of the stuff of a lot of the work that Gabrielle's done spans just so many years. I mean, stuff that decades, and those threads from projects, they feel very familiar to me, because they're things that I started in 2001 and then really just left unfinished. And all these other things I picked up on over the years, but then to see all of it pulled together so well, some things that are, and so in such a multidisciplinary way, things that are audio tours and photography and just talking to people and being on the street and in different places across time, and then it all coming together in a book that's very accessible and it's really great. It was really great. That was a very long bio for you. That was sorry. Well, but we'll talk. We'll talk more about the book. At first, I think we're going to look at photos poems that are in the book that you will have if you too get a book. And Gabrielle will read, and you too will read. And then we will talk more.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Veronica. And clearly we had like a mutual appreciation fan club without knowing that we were both part of that fan club, because I was doing kind of the same thing with Veronica. I was like, she's so cool. Gotta meet her. She's like the best, and Word Up is the best. And so I've been a huge fan from early on in the pop-up and all of the pieces, and just, and I think one of the reasons that I was so excited to do a talk here and to talk about this work in this space is because I think it's important both to talk about this book and this project in the places that it's about, but it's also really important to talk about it in places that are kind of not looking back, but are looking forward and are making new places and are thinking about, well, what do we do in everyday places that build community now and going forward, and what does that look like as a future-looking thing? And how do we learn from some of this past work, but also how do we move forward? And I very much see Word Up and recirculation as those kinds of spaces. So it's very exciting to be thinking about it with all of you, with all of everybody from Word Up and from recirculation, to be thinking about that here. So I'm going to read a little bit, very short bit, from the introduction, just to kind of give you a little bit of a sense of the work. And then, as Veronica said, we're gonna ask a couple of you guys to read some of the stories, because I think it's really important to have some of the voices from the book in the room with us when we're talking about it. So way back in 2001, when I asked Mike in Prospect Heights how he had prepared to take me on the tour of his neighborhood that I had requested, he explained, I said to myself, we'll take a walk around the block and I'll tell you what I know, So much of the work of being human happens in everyday places. We become ourselves, we become able to see each other, to be a community. Everyday places are personal, but also global, intertwining history, emotion, and memory. They're experienced, talked about, negotiated, and woven into our lives. We create places, and in turn, they create us. It's not too much to say that these small public and semi-public spaces even have the potential to be spaces of liberation. It's in these spaces that we find the cities we need. So what are these remarkable everyday spaces? They're often thought of as banal, so sidewalks and diners and bus stops, churches, meeting places, barber shops, bike shops, repair shops, donut shops, laundromats, schools, parks, playgrounds, libraries, bookstores. The work that these places do helps us become ourselves and to become communities, or at least to be able to be together with strangers, laying the groundwork for a functional society. And I call that work place work. So becoming communities was what David told me about at the supermarket that we just saw. Tanya at the diner, Cynthia in front of her house, and Marty on neighborhood streets. That's also the diner. It's intensely personal work that happens in public. Places can help our bodies feel free and can also help us shape the way we feel we belong. So really thinking about the ways that we become ourselves. And becoming community, being together with strangers, was what I heard from Tawolde in the donut shop, Neville in the electronics store, Julia at the fence. I could see how their places fostered two crucial kinds of talk, the casual but humanity acknowledging qualities of everyday banter, and the enduring talk that grows over weeks, over years, that builds on trust, and might eventually change everything. So in this book, my tour guides in Brooklyn and Oakland take us on walks through places that do each of these kinds of work. The work that helps us become ourselves and helps us be together. So they notice what's usually taken for granted, talking about the place work in these two somewhat unremarkable, though very beloved by their residents, neighborhoods. But of course, it happens in many cities and towns and neighborhoods all over New York as well. Probably some you know well, one of the ones being the one we're in right now. And these places, they also help us figure out how we relate to worlds that are far beyond our everyday. Oh, I see, Cynthia and Mosswood exclaimed as we talked about why I was asking her for her tour of the neighborhood in Oakland. Echoing what Doreen Massey called the global sense of the local, Cynthia proceeded to find the best, most elegant way of describing this project. And she said, oh, I see what you're asking me. You want to know, it's about how people fit the big world into their small worlds. So I'm hoping we can look at a couple of the photographs from the book. And I'll just say, just in terms of the methodology of the work, I had asked people for their tours of these neighborhoods. And then afterwards, I would photograph the places that they took me to, and then show them the photographs that I had made. And we would talk more about the photographs. And part of it was also to understand, like, what are the stories you tell when you're kind of walking and moving through a place and having that embodied experience of place? And what are the stories, maybe the slower stories that you can. So that's just a weird thing to do. So what is that? What kind of stories come through that? And that was Lois looking at her photos. So just to give you a sense of some of the photographs that I was taking of people's places, this is Oakland. There's the supermarket, David's supermarket. And these kind of alternate between Brooklyn and Oakland. This is Brooklyn. And that store's still there. This is Oakland. There's Cynthia's block. And so I wanted to give you all a sense, one piece of this project was after all of these tours and photographs and stories that in 2015 and 2016, I brought all of this work back to the neighborhood in Brooklyn where I had started doing these tours in Prospect Heights, and started these walking tours and kind of interventions throughout the whole neighborhood with these little guidebooks around the neighborhood. So people were finding them and picking them up at the supermarket and bodega and all kinds of things. They were different colors, so you could collect all 6. That was very exciting. There were different people's stories. And part of what we did was I would take people on tours, and at each point, everyone would have one person's group of stories. And as we walked around, I would ask people to read somebody else's story about that place. So part of what was powerful about that was really kind of everybody having to hold somebody else's story and to take care of it and represent it and read it out loud for other people. So I'm gonna ask you guys to do a little bit of that right now. So I think we're gonna start off with Veronica to read this one. Right in title page. This one is on page 69. And are there maybe 2 or 3 other people who would volunteer to read a story? Yes, Sheena, I know you have a book right there. Awesome. Will you read one? Okay, all right, amazing. Go ahead.
It doesn't have to be a big thing that you do. George's, the usual 637 Vanderbilt Avenue. I really like this place. Besides the fact that you see different people, you just hear people talking, joshing around. It's a very mixed crowd in here, race, sex, age. You see people from all different backgrounds. You see cops come in here, you see sanitation, you see park, police, plumbers, accountants, politicians, and you hear people talking trash. It's funny. Mike gives the place its life, because he'll talk to anybody and he'll talk crap with anybody. Here in New York, America, you have this whole thing about being somebody, and being somebody of a certain level. The doctor, the lawyer, the Wall Street, whatever. And you have people here who have a life. They run a luncheonette, they make people happy, and they know they make people happy. They like it, they come back. They don't like it, they don't come back. It appeals to me very viscerally. It makes me realize, yeah, you need some money, but you don't need to be chasing a dollar with the exemption of everything else. And it doesn't have to be a big thing that you do. I feel that they love it, and that makes me like it also. If I'm in a bad mood and I come in here, I walk out in a better mood. It's just a place. It's comfortable, you know? Tanya, 2002.
Okay. So Shayna, you're up next, I think. Okay. So this one, I think this is 173. Let's see. This is told a story from the donut shop. Oh no, that's not. You're no. Okay. 203.
I think I definitely want the donut shop. Alright. We used to just sit there all day. Telegraph from 42nd Street. I was one of the first Eritrean refugees that came into the United States in the 1980s. And there were lots of organizations to support the Eritrean People's Liberation Front fighting for independence from Ethiopia. Golden Gate Donut Cafe. We used to just sit there all day. I'm not kidding you. When I say all day, I mean all day. There are hardly any people there now, but you know it's always been like that. Those of us who didn't work on weekends, we'd get in the mornings, we'd have donuts and just sit there, smoke and sit until it's time for the meeting. At that time, it was not political so much as getting to know other Eritreans, just being friends and starting in this new place. The guys didn't mind us sitting there all day. And you know, filling the place up with smoke. We sat here and this is what we saw. People would come in, buy donuts and coffee and leave, but we just sat there. Actually, people still frequented this long after independence too, but I haven't been there since then. So different places, different buildings have different emotions and different memories. It's Walday, 2006.
Thank you. Okay, I'll read one, and Andrew, you can do that. Or actually, you know what? Maybe you can do this one. Do you have a book, or can you borrow somebody? Okay, here, you're going to read. So this one is 173.
173?
Mm-hmm.
The store hasn't been touched. 641 Vanderbilt Avenue. My friend, who was in the same electronics business like me, died, and they closed the store with all his stuff inside. He was a cricketer in the West Indies, and his friends, who were his old cricketers, they always used to meet every Thursday around that table, have their drink. 2 years ago, he passed away, and they still meet every Thursday afternoon, still the same way. They went to the hospital for a checkup, and they found something, and they operated, and when they operated, he died. See, everything's still here. The store hasn't been touched. If I need anything, I'm short of anything, instead of buying it, I get it from him. Neville, 2001.
I'll read the last one unless somebody else would like to read. Sorry. So there were people here. Telegraph Avenue and 34th Street. So we're alternating between Brooklyn and Oakland. This neighborhood was pretty solidly black. Lois and I grew up 2 blocks further down, but we were up here all the time. We used to hit the plum trees up there. The hospitals were there, but they were much smaller. If you look at this neighborhood, it was a lot more prosperous commercially because there were houses in here under the freeway. There were people here. I would babysit for all the kids here, just as they would babysit for me. Lois has her dad's complexion and looks, and her dad was a red cap. You know, the red caps were the porters. I can never forget. Jack would be coming home with that uniform on, and I'd say, I always wanted to be like him. And he'd say, no, 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 boy, you don't want to do this kind of work. This is the same kind of work your great uncle did. My great uncle Frank was a Pullman porter too, but he worked out of Chicago and LA for the Southern Pacific. Uncle Frank got a master's degree from the University of Chicago in 1921. Where the hell was he going to work? No one was going to hire him. This was why you had this degree of progressivism among these Pullman porters, because so many of them were so much better educated than the people who were actually on the train. What we saw on this block was not the kind of blight that you see now, but people going to work every day, black men going to work every day. And I just want to close our reading with this last story. This was kind of the last story that somebody told me in Oakland, and it was our neighbor Amajat, who at the time was 12, and I asked her if she could take me on a tour. Where would she take me? And she turned around behind our houses, and she pointed and she said, you know, when you stand out and you can see where the freeways are and you can see the sun setting, that part right there. Thank you all.
Earlier today, and thinking about, you just mentioned that these are stories that, you've held for all of these years and that we all held briefly and passed around. And then your experience of having these events with this book and seeing the tour guides and meeting with them recently. And I wondered if you could share a little bit about that, the stories that you've held for all these years and that have, they all are very important, but like, which of them, where people ended up and like
where the actual tour guides
the
now,
actual
or
tour guides ended up, and it just everything about all.
Sure. Well, I will say, so I have held these stories in my head for a long time, and it is funny because, of course, I've spoken to everybody and thought, finally, this thing is going to be a book, and I'm like, oh, do you remember that time when you told me this thing? And they're like, no, I don't remember that. That was 20 years ago. Are you a crazy person? I'm like, no, why? Why would I remember that? I'm like, oh no, you said something so good. It was amazing. And they're like, yeah, okay, I trust you, but whatever, who knows? And so then I've sent them quotes, and they've been like, oh, that was really good. Yeah, oh yeah. So that's been, I think, because I've listened to these stories over and over again and read them again. I'll say that they also, before even talking about the people themselves, in doing this work for 20 years, it's a huge part of my life. And so their stories are a huge part of shaping my life and my learning and kind of who I am. And so, I think in part it's really thinking a lot about how I started this work when I was 24, and I'm not 24 anymore. That's a big surprise. And a lot of the things that people were telling me about were places, in moments in their lives that I just hadn't experienced. And so in kind of living with these stories over and over, things kind of come back to me now as like, oh, now I see what she meant. Or kind of it helps me, they have genuinely helped me think about kind of moments of challenge in my own life. And so, even when I've said that to people, they're like, oh, that's too much. Why have you spent that much time thinking about what I said to you? But I really think that that's so important, and the value of kind of listening to people's stories and the way in which people can tell these really extraordinary, sort of thoughtful, quite wise things, but that come through very everyday practices and very everyday places. So I've lived with these stories for so long, and they really, I'm like, oh, that reminds me of when, Tanya said this, or whenever it does. But so all of the people who are in the book, in reaching out to them, have been so genuinely excited about the work, but also, a lot of them, 20 years is a long time, so people's lives have really changed. And a lot of people have said, oh, I had forgotten that thing, but now that you remind me of it through even the story that I told about that place, it really kind of helps me recover some of those feelings that I had about that neighborhood, maybe where I'm not anymore, or, those kinds of stories. And that's quite a meaningful experience to have these really small things sort of brought back to people. Several people have passed away, so there's, I think even in this, there's, kind of a lot of loss held in the book as well. And so, and all of them, I think, too soon, right? So and also there are people who are really quite elderly and are struggling with a lot of health problems. And so, even just kind of holding that, and, also because I've been living with their stories from 20 years ago, also seeing them now is always that disjunction for me, and to try and think through that that's been important too.
Is anyone still in place?
Or
out of the number
yes.
of people who are featured, how many of them are alive but not living? Where they were first guiding?
Yeah. Some. I would say less than half are still where they were, but there are a few people who kind of are in place. But a lot of people kind of, even right around the time that I was doing this, kind of were either being displaced or were no longer able to. So some of that I already knew where they were. So that was actually, especially in Brooklyn, like sort of between that, kind of 2004 to 2007 period, a lot of those people. And so by the time that I went back to Brooklyn in 2015 to do those walking tours, about half of the people in Brooklyn were no longer there. So that was dramatic.
Yeah, I remember one of the characters who you interview in the Prospect Heights part, but they really wanted to be in Park Slope. But they had already been pushed out of there.
So that was Neville, who's talking about having the party in the back of the shop with his friends. Yeah, he was like, oh, actually, I really don't have that much connection to Prospect Heights. I actually really connect to this kind of history of Park Slope as this very diverse kind of homesteading space, but I was never able to actually buy a place there. And he, that was him in the picture of the bike store, which is still there on Union Street. And so he would talk about how that, and I will say those people, I had gone in there with Neville on our walking tour. And I'd gotten in there once with him with the camera, and I'd been in there many other times in other ways, but because the photograph is in the book and their story is in the book, I had gotten in touch with them, and I gave them a call, just like on the store number, and I was like, is David there? And this is really weird. I'm sorry. And so he was like, oh yeah, what's up? And I was like, well, 20 years ago, I came into your store with Neville, and we were taking photographs. He was like, oh yeah, of course. I was like, hi. He was like, of course, I remember you. Yeah. And so even in that connection, like thinking about kind of that story, and also because that connection to Neville, he was like, oh, that was like really the last time I saw him, and I really have thought about you and that kind of interaction so much, that's like kind of amazing to have it kind of come back into my world. So yeah, very.
I love all this over time. That part of those years in Brooklyn when, some of the neighborhoods, I think of how much they changed between, we were talking before, how we're similar in age, and I have a lot of milestones that are, within a few years of the ones that you're marking, and I remember certain neighborhoods in Brooklyn looking completely different, but a lot of those being affected by those middle, the early aughts, but the rezonings, and by, just even the mention of them,
Right.
And before anything has even happened, and then the actual process of, someone trying for it, and then it actually going through. And I remember too how, reading Jeremiah Moss's Vanishing New York. I remember reading that book and thinking, with a little bit of relief, that there wasn't a chapter on Washington Heights Inwood at the time. And I think by the end of that year, having read that book, then the rezoning had been certified, whatever the term is, that had gone through in Inwood. And now that you've been, I don't know how many years you've been a resident up in Washington Heights,
Since 2007.
2007. I guess there's not a specific question, but there's so many questions about what you've seen or experienced of that. There are questions you ask about the book of what can we learn from these stories of Prospect Heights that we can apply, but who is going to apply those who's going to apply those learnings? You know, who is going to follow up with community benefits agreements? Where are those listed and posted? And you know, who is to be accountable for what does or doesn't happen?
Yeah.
So I mean, they're two big questions, but
We'll just solve that right now. No big deal. Yeah, no, I mean, I think that, you know, so this book, it all kind of in one way or another kind of takes place with the backdrop of really large developments happening in both of these places, right? So the Atlantic Yards development, which was proposed in 2004, 2005, which ended up using eminent domain, kind of the later version of urban renewal, to build Barclays Stadium, and a huge development all along Atlantic Avenue. That, which, spoiler alert, is not finished. So yeah, that proposal, and I should say, you know, that I could see it happening, and I could see even as that was proposed, what kind of the way that it really tore the neighborhood apart in terms of kind of who was for and who was against it, and what people thought was going to come from it. And that, you know, there was this promise that there was going to be affordable housing that was part of it, and so that was a real sweetener for it. And there were also people who said, well, when will you actually build this affordable housing, and how affordable will it actually be? And all of those questions, which I'm sure anybody in this neighborhood has heard as well, right? These are the same questions that we keep having over and over again. And, you know, so that, and also that kind of knock-on effect of the ways in which really large-scale development gets proposed, and then what happens to the rest of the neighborhood, whether or not the thing gets built or how long it takes. The impact of that is really dramatic, and I think very frequently is talked about as, you know, these sort of unintended consequences, which is, as we were talking about earlier, I was like, that's completely insane because it keeps happening. So you must intend it, or you just weren't paying attention, right? So that piece, I think, is a huge part of this book. And I would also say is a huge part of Contested City. So that book is about a failed urban renewal site on the Lower East Side. But one of the things that, and I kept, as I was sort of working on this and figuring out where this work fit, I started working on the Lower East Side, and I could see even in this very long-term sort of failed development site and the pressures and the questions about what would happen on the Lower East Side, where I could see many of the same conversations happening in both places, right? And then many of those conversations are the kinds of conversations that people have been having around the Inwood rezoning, right? And questions about, well, what does this do to the neighborhood? What does this do in a larger way about kind of affordability? And, you know, in the context of this book, then what does it do for the places that do this work, right? Does it build capacity for those places, or does it actually take down?
This story standing in the place where that thing probably wasn't, you know, anymore. And I mean, all of that is so, there's so much to that, there's so many layers to that, and it's so, you know, but it seems like we need so much more of that to have like everyone feel moved in the way that I found this all moving. But you know, then there's the question of, okay, in like an artist's work, or you know, that's where one place where it can happen. But then there's also the that question of art washing, you know, within sort of gentrifying spaces, like what kind of spaces, and I ask this as an arts organization, what kind of spaces can we help make? Do other people need to help make? Can we be facilitating, you know, a lot more people to make, so that it's a much more widespread conversation?
Yeah, I think, you know, many of the things that many of the places in the book that people took me to that were so valuable to them and that were really meaningful to them were, you know, I've been trying to think of like, well, were similar qualities about them? You know, one of them I would say is that they were either free or low cost in one way or another, but also that they kind of
provided something that a lot of different people wanted, right? And that provided kind of a context in which conversation could happen. Because I feel like there's this other piece that's like, people often ask me how I found these tour guides, and like, they're like, it's so hard to talk to people. I was like, well, I didn't just accost them on the street. Like, that just generally doesn't work. Because like, I don't know about you, but that's not how I roll. But I think that thing of saying, well, you need these spaces in which a conversation can arise, and it seems like that's the tricky thing. And also, I think a lot about this idea of, these places where it's like, okay, how do we just be with strangers? Like, I think we're also just genuinely very bad at it. Not like by our nature, but by, between COVID and segregated cities and all the pieces of that become really, that really shifts the way that we are with other people, right? And so one piece of this also seems to be like, well, what is it that who kind of facilitates these conversations, right? Not in a like, let's all get together and have this meaningful conversation, but like just allows people to have any conversation at all. That starts to be a huge part of the work. And I think that idea of saying, well, there's so much that really is huge that we all need to talk about and have capacity, in this city, in this country, there's an election, all that kind of stuff. But we need to, like, it's really hard to jump in at the deep end and say, well, let's talk about these really serious, complex, multi-year, multi-generational problems if you haven't practiced like a low stakes kind of way of chatting with somebody too. Like, and so I keep thinking about like that idea of many of these places are like, they allow kind of the low stakes talking trash piece, right? And that's really powerful, like that we can't really get to having meaningful dialogue without that first. And so if we are kind of constantly in more and more of a situation where it's so, everything is so transactional, there's very little of that, the talking crap, right? If there's not a place for that, it makes it very difficult to kind of go to any next further level. And so I think a lot about that and like, what does that look like? What does it look like to protect the spaces in which that can happen? And so sometimes that's just like these very, baseline things that we should be doing anyway. Like, what does it mean to protect tenure of people over the long term in housing and in small businesses? What does it mean for people to actually be able to control how the land is? All of that. What does that look like? But I think it's like to also be valuing like, this is what we want to have happen in this space. So it's not just, because sometimes I think we fixate on like the space itself. And so in thinking a lot about this idea of place work, I think a lot about this idea of like, well, what is it that these places like do for us? Like, and also I think people are a little bit selfish and that's okay. But to say, this stuff isn't like, oh, it's nice for people to get together. That's so nice. It's like, no, this is like actually existential because we're thinking about like, what does it mean to both for ourselves to be able to develop as humans? Like that's a huge part of what people were telling me about on these tours was that these places were the places where they felt like they could be themselves. It felt like they could be free. They felt like they could kind of belong. And those things are the things that made them as individuals like have capacity to go out into the world and be successful human beings, right? And to feel good, having nothing to do with how they were with other people. And I think then it is important to kind of say, yes, and it is also about the way we are together and how we negotiate together, that those things are also important. So that balance then kind of, I really think that piece of thinking not only about the places, which very often are important as themselves, but also to value this thing that they are doing and be able to see it and to name it. And I think that's the piece of it, right? So that, and it's really hard because there's so much work around, in terms of preservation, very much of it is focused on the physical, right? It's focused on the physical place, it's focused on like a landmark, right? But how do you think about community preservation so that it's both preserving a community that is in a neighborhood, but also preserving the things that kind of allow that community to function? Like, what is it that actually builds capacity for people to be together? So I think those things, it's not easy. It's like, I wish it was like, build a bench. That would be so easy, right? But I do feel like there's that shift, and to take that seriously, like, requires like quite a mind shift to be able to value those things. Because I think, very often those are the things that are like, yeah, that's nice, whatever, change happens, right? And it's also to say, change doesn't happen. Change happens because somebody made money off that change. And so it's really quite important to also be able to counter that piece and to say, well, let's talk about the financial piece of this, because decisions are made and different decisions could be made. But so much of the kind of cities that we live in, the environments that we occupy, we're told they are kind of the way they are because that's sort of the way of it. And that's clearly not true, right? It's not even hard to prove that. But I think it's so powerful as a narrative that it's like, what does it take to shift that narrative and to be able to say, okay, well, how do we actually value these other pieces, right? And what does it look like to protect that? Yeah.
Something you said, this is a total side note, is when we, in the pop-up version of Word Up, when everyone was coming in and asking for everything at that point, do you have pets? Do you have like whatever, school supplies, this, that, and the other. And you're like, well, what do we need? And then, hive mind. And we need chairs. Like the bench question, right? You don't just need that. You need so much more. Everybody needed, some housing tips. Everyone needed all this stuff. But the first thing that, I think someone determined, hopefully, was to start somewhere was, we need some chairs, like sit around and talk to each other. We just had boxes before that we sat on. But I want to leave time for questions. I have so many other questions, but if you need 15, I want to see who has questions or comments or something that will lead to a question or anything.
You talked a little bit about your journey. I mean, this is 20 years long. I'm just curious what was the genesis of this project, where it started, and where it has ended up, and is this where you thought it would, is this what you had in mind when you started thinking about it? Probably not. So yeah, I'm just curious, like, how did this evolve over 20 years?
Yeah, short. Yeah. I think so I've been asking people for their guided tours. Oh, sorry. I've been asking people for their guided tours for a really long time. So before Brooklyn and Oakland. Both kind of around the United States. Somebody was asking me about this, like, why is it called The Cities We Need? Do you care about the rural people? I was like, yes, it's very interesting to me. I'm just like, I am from here, and I'm like very bad at rural. Like, this is not my thing. But I'm cows. Like, I'm like genuinely surprised by cows. That's kind of how I am. Sorry. And then I said, oh yes, but actually I did do all these tours with people in South Texas, peanut farmers. And the guy was like, wait, okay, I don't know what to say to that. But so this, like, I've been quite interested in this thing of people's tours and how do people talk about their own places, especially in places where it's like, I really don't know where I am and what is meaningful. And I think some of it started, in some ways as a photographer, because I was like, I want to make photographs, but also like, I don't want to be that jerk who's just like, I'm just taking photographs and now I took pictures of your place and now I know everything about it. And I was like, no, I would actually much more rather know from people's stories
to tell me what's important about it. And I'm not gonna say, oh, and then you take the pictures. Like, I was interested, even though that is also a thing. I was like, no, I think there's something valuable in the making of the work, but I want to hear the stories that are important because there's so much that I can't know. So that was the biggest version of that was in London before this. And then when we moved to Brooklyn, I was kind of in the neighborhood in Prospect Heights, and I was like, you know what, at this place, I feel like I need to figure this place out. You know, I'm from New York, and but new to that neighborhood, I didn't know it, and so it felt very compelling. I felt like I kind of love this place, and I like all these people, but I don't really know any of these stories. And I think so. Neville was my first tour, and I met him because I was standing outside the building with my camera, and he said, "Oh, I take photographs too. Do you want to see my my camera collection?" I was like, "Yes, I definitely do." And so we started that conversation that way, because he was my neighbor in the building, and I said, "Well, you've lived here a really long time. Would you take me on a tour of the neighborhood?" I said, "Yeah, absolutely." So it got started that way, and then I just started asking more people in the neighborhood, and it eventually grew into the subject of my dissertation, and which was comparing and looking at everyday place in Brooklyn and in Oakland, and partly thinking about when we lived in Oakland. I thought, well, maybe this would be a good comparison, because sometimes when you make work only about New York City, it's like, well, that's just weird because New York is weird, so whatever. It's like its own special strangeness. And I thought, well, it wouldn't be the worst to figure out whether some of the things that people were talking about in New York were similar to things that people are talking about elsewhere. And in doing research about the neighborhood in Oakland that we lived in, I could see a lot of parallels to some of the kind of especially post-war histories of Oakland and Brooklyn, the relationship to redlining, which is obviously pre-war, but kind of all of the kinds of urban renewal, the demolitions, all of those pieces, and the ways that shaped these two neighborhoods. Also kind of neighborhoods that were a bit like kind of buffer zones. They were actually described that way in some of the homeowners loan corporation, the mapping of kind of rating of neighborhoods. So I could see these parallels, even though those two neighborhoods looked super different. Like you could see from the pictures of Oakland, like expanse as opposed to really being quite close together. So I think that piece was like, okay, these histories make sense together. They help explain each other. What happens if I keep asking people kind of around those same questions? What happens? Are there parallels between the stories that people are telling me? And then I finished the dissertation, and then I was like, yeah, I don't really know what to do with that work anymore. I would really like to make public work around it, but I don't really know why. It never really, grad school was traumatizing. I was like, okay, we're done. But in 2015, I had gone back to Prospect Heights. By then I lived here, so like going to Brooklyn was like, a day-long trip, stay over. So I hadn't been there for a while, and I saw how much had changed, and it felt like, oh, well, I happen to have this very weird archive of people's everyday experiences and everyday places from before. It was all from before Atlantic Yards was proposed. And I remember it being proposed, and I thought, oh my God, I just spent the last 4 years doing research on this before anyone cared about this neighborhood, and now I'm kind of done, and now it's like when something important is happening, and I'm like, what am I doing? But it turned out that in having that kind of moment from before that, it helped make this public project that was like, okay, let's, we can use that as a way to help understand what's happened in, say, the intervening 10 to 12 years to understand the kinds of changes that have been wrought in the neighborhood. And it was really helpful to think about using that archive as a way to help make place for people to talk. And then I had always wanted to turn it into a book and have a kind of further public piece of this, but then I was like, yeah, I'm just not sure why or what it looks like or what it is. And it genuinely was the pandemic where, in lockdown, feeling like there's a huge amount of grief, and there's so much fear of, obviously of like death, but also of that feeling like if you can't be in these places where you were kind of building sense of place and sense of community, like how much loss was in that. And that was when I was like hearing these people's voices in my head, like, oh, wait, what they were saying to me all that time ago is like really helpful in this moment and will be really helpful in terms of thinking like, what happens when ideally this whole situation is over? What happens then? Like, how do we value what we lost or what we missed, and how do we talk about it? So I think that was the kind of moment of thinking like, oh, there's like something at stake, and maybe I should write a book while we're all in lockdown and really like have nothing to do. Yeah, of course. So, look, I get on your remote school and I'll do some writing and it's gonna be great. So yeah. So I think that whole archive. Sorry, that was a long answer to that question.
This is going to sound really granular, but this is a question about how public art ends. So recently I was going through some boxes from when I moved several years ago, and I found a complete set of the beautiful pamphlets from Prospect Heights that you had given me in each of the colors. And I'm really curious, like, did you ever go back and collect them? Did it ever end if you went back? Like, is there anywhere in Prospect Heights where there might just be like an old dusty display and they're still there?
But no, the people did want their space back because like it was like in stores and stuff.
Yeah.
So they were there for months. They were big, and so eventually
the pamphlets are small.
The pamphlets were small, but they were in things
And
that were
display.
larger.
Yeah.
And
like, how did you know when it was time for that
well, it
piece
was
of it to go away, or did they just run out of?
that was a
materials?
year. No, they're still under my bed. So nobody ran out. I keep feeling like I should bring them to these book talks. We could really get rid of them, but then I feel like so much schlepping. But how does it end? Well, that one was exciting because it was a year, and we planned it to be a year. So they were up for a really long time, and out in the neighborhood for a really long time. And we made a new one at the end of it because we were doing like new oral histories in response to the tours. So we made another pamphlet at the end because we wanted to like make another public thing from what had happened through the course of the project. And so then that was out in the world. But then I brought those pamphlets back. They did live in somebody else's basement in Brooklyn for a while. And then I have brought them back kind of multiple times for like mini versions of it. So one time in a couple of different times, but the most recent one was in 2019, that summer. And there was like kind of a neighborhood community day, and I kind of did a little stands and stuff and the pamphlets, and had these cards for people to like write their own stories about the neighborhood. And it was striking to me that so many, I was like, okay, now these stories are actually quite old, but like people still had just as much to say about the place and just as much sort of desire to talk about it, and were just as like inspired by these things, quite a few years after the whole project had started, and wanted to kind of respond to them in their own way. So I think that was, that was I was like, oh yeah, this is still really relevant. This is still really working to do what people kind of need it to do. So yes, so it has like come back and back. I mean, potentially writing a book about it might be like the end of the project. But I do think that, one of the things that has come up so often in a lot of like book events or other kinds of things is where people have just really wanted to talk about their places, like that it seems as important now as ever for people to talk about what's important to them, or the place, or what they miss, or what they've lost, and to talk about those things. So kind of, but I like these things, so it's okay.
Did you ever do any audio tours of Washington?
I didn't. I haven't. I've thought about it a lot. And maybe now is the moment. People keep asking me also, I did an event in Brooklyn, and somebody was like, well, can I suggest my neighborhood for you to come to next? And I was like, oh no. I was like, did I not say the part how that took 20 years? Like, I don't know. And also, again, commuting from Washington Heights, I can't do it anymore. But I do really think a lot about, well, what does it look like to do some related project here? And what, because I think one of the things that is important to me is like, well, why? What does it matter? What's at stake? I mean, I think there's a lot at stake, but like, what are the ways to do that so that it makes sense? And so I've just been like ticking over in my mind for a while. And I think one of the things that's always been really important to me has been to be in collaboration, like with organizations, with community members. So what does it look like, not just to sort of be like, I just want to do audio tours, but what does it look like to think about how it's part of something larger? So yes, it's definitely been on my mind, but it hasn't. And I keep feeling like, man, I should have done that like 15 years ago. It's not always.
Any questions or thoughts about anything that's come up?
As you're talking, one of the things I'm thinking is about the before and after. How did those community places, I mean, some I think it sounds like have disappeared in ways. What replaced them, and also, I look at my own family and my own history, and I feel like we are so much more transient in our country than we were 40 years ago. My neighborhood was this neighborhood. Now, even within that neighborhood, kids are going to different schools and they're moving out after 5 years, and it's like very nondescript suburban neighborhood that has undergone a lot of just shifting. And so when those shifts happen, what happens? Where do just new places become those places of gathering, and new people are there? And I've just been curious about your thoughts about what happens in those upheavals.
Yeah, I think I think it can be either way. I think I will say a lot of the places in Prospect Heights. I mean, so we were talking this morning, and I was saying I did a book talk in a small bookstore in Prospect Heights, and it was all people who lived like very close to the bookstore, and basically the whole conversation was sad. I would say, like, we were like trying not to be sad, but it was very sad. So it was like, but there's some good things. So, and I think that piece of it, that particular neighborhood is quite dramatically changed. And I think a lot of the places, and I mean, genuinely, huge numbers of people have been displaced from that neighborhood, and it's pretty clear in the census demographics. But I think and then I think it's like, well, that question of like, where are these places that people find kind of like, you can kind of sit for a long time? And, in part that's because, New York City rent is very high, right? And so you're like paying people's rent by sitting in the chair, right? But also like, what are the places that allow that to happen? And I would say, particularly in Prospect Heights, there's not very many of those left. And so I think there's a huge amount of sadness of people feeling like, I just can't have that experience that people were like, I recognize that experience, but then I kind of lost it, and I didn't realize that I lost it, and now I'm hearing somebody else's story, and it's making me feel kind of terrible. So that actually has come up quite a lot of that thing. But I don't think it means, cities, suburbs, everywhere changes, like change really happens, right? So
what does it mean for change to happen, but to protect the work that we all, like as humans, we all actually need, right? And so I think that's the piece that I'm always like, I don't want the work to be like this nostalgia trip of like, well, it's all gone and now we can't do anything about it. And it's part of the reason I was really excited to do something here and like to do work and to talk about this in places where it's like, you know, people are making new spaces. People are trying to think about, well, what does it look like to actually find ways to get people to be together in, you know, new kind of ways. And I think that's I think important to kind of think further through, right? And I think that idea of change, you know, that does really happen, but it can change in a variety of ways, and we can kind of try and make choices about that, how that happens.
We did talk about how some of the past events, there's been a lot of sadness and grief and mourning, and how we wouldn't let this one just be about that. So I realized that maybe some of my questions actually include audience members, because I know that there are people, I mean, I don't know everybody in the audience, but some of the people I do know are teachers of, you know, longtime teachers in the neighborhood, of kids, or people who've been working on, you know, like like housing issues, leading up to the rezoning, post rezoning, and you know, I guess I have a question for you all. Like, what do you see as, you know, what effects of the changes that have happened have you seen among your community members and experience, but also what do you see of what is promising about what can happen going forward?
Yeah, I was just wondering, thank you very much for the talk and for everybody's comments. If there's a way, because people want to talk and they want to do these tours, like, is there a way to, I mean, you can't do them personally. You know, like I can see like, yeah, another 20 years, but is there a way to like make it so people, like there's a template where people can like create their own guided tour and do it with their neighbors, or like a little more of a engagement thing? And I mean, I'm just thinking, I'm working on a project in Bay Ridge with artists doing ecological projects, and so we actually have been doing tours to the artists to just get them oriented. And like, this is just what you do, it's just such a great idea, but it feels like how it could be, you could kind of create a core of people to do this as a like, to your point, like a sort of discovery around where are, like right now, where are those places in Washington Heights and Inwood that people are valuing? So we know those places and we capture them and we share them and understand that there's this big map of important things that not all, you know, like it's a network, right, of places.
I think one of the things that, I haven't made a like do-it-yourself kit to do these, but one of the things that actually I did really love about the work in Brooklyn in 2015 in that project called Intersection was part of what, you know, we would do these tours with people and people would read other people's stories out loud. But then if people wanted to tell their own oral history, we paired neighbors up to do that, and we did it at the library, and that was really great, and it felt like this way of kind of building this capacity for people to talk with each other, but also to provide a context, because I think there's something that's also really important about, you know, even in thinking about the tours or the giving of tours and then listening to other people's tours, like it feels like you
you kind of, you like, and this even like will tell me a story about your neighborhood, kind of requires a little bit of a context or a little bit of a something to respond to, so that it doesn't either stay kind of at the surface level, or that it doesn't sort of just veer off on one topic, that it, you know, that you're giving, that I think part of the project, and I think one of the things that was important to me about like taking the photographs and then coming back to people was to say like, you know, we did this thing together, I'm showing you something that I saw, there's a kind of exchange, and then here's a way, like, tell me what you think, like there's a response, and also it's fine if you don't like it. Like, and that thing in saying that's not right is in itself really like important. So then I think a lot about that in terms of structuring any kind of like public engagement, that it's like, well, how are you kind of, you know, both carefully kind of making the context for it to happen, just like the places themselves, like how are they making the context and kind of who's kind of helping facilitate that conversation to happen, but then also what does it look like then to take care of the stories that you hear. And so that was always something that I was quite, I wanted to be really thoughtful about, was like, these people are telling me amazing things and also very vulnerable things, so how am I taking care of the stories that they're telling me? So those are things, I mean, which isn't to say that it couldn't be this bigger public project, but those are the kinds of things that I think about in like thinking about, well, what would it look like to do that? But I am curious if anybody who's kind of thinking about it, like kind of maybe even as a last word, I know it's getting late, especially for some of us. But just to hear even like where, you know, you're finding these spaces now, either in Washington Heights and Inwood or anywhere, you know, or where are the things that you feel like kind of you've lost, or that you're thinking about in the context of all of this?
You can go. Absolutely. I think there are a few organizations that are already sort of like leading these kind of tours of different neighborhoods that are more community based. So there's like a few nonprofits that lead these kind of tours. But I don't know, as an organizer, I feel like you mentioned that you didn't walk up to people just randomly. Like, I think it's perfectly fine to walk up to people randomly and like start a conversation and that we'll get to know people. And folks always want to share their story. So I say like go, like just ask folks on the street and tell them like, what's the significance of where you are to you, or like where do you see people in that. I'm sure that they'd be more than like willing to share that story. Is what I would say. But I think like here in, well, at least like in I live closer to Inwood. What I've been seeing a lot that I really love, and I know like there's this sort of like story of in Latinx communities, especially Caribbean ones, of like the playing dominoes outside and like, you know, but what I found is dominoes. I mean not dominoes, bingo. And all of like the older folks playing bingo out in the park, and how they like stay out till wee hours and like are so freaking engaged. So that's very funny and cute to me. How they've like built these communities around playing the most boring games ever. And yeah, like I think that's wonderful that like we have, like you mentioned, that I think like New York is so expensive, and anywhere you go you have to spend money. That it's amazing that we have these, a lot of like open space where folks can convene, and also like, yeah, make use of sidewalks, because those are public spaces too. So, side note. And then I think like I grew up in the Lower East Side, like next to a Burger King and a McDonald's, and all of the old Puerto Rican men would convene at the Burger King and the McDonald's. And so like as you were talking, like I was like, I wonder if like anybody took you to that sort of, because there was also this long article once that I read about like why old men were convening in fast food chain restaurants. And it has to do a lot with like where can you stay, buy something cheap, and like they're not gonna bother you, as opposed to like if you go coffee shop, they're like, when are you sort of like getting out? So all that is like sort of like very interesting to me. And then I am part of a community land trust here in the neighborhood. And I think like for me, it's like more than preservation. It's more of like, what do we consider to be sort of like these rights that we all have? And I don't think about those rights just being, and I do agree that obviously like this right to housing is solemnly like very important, but what other rights do we have? Like, do we have rights to arts? Like, do we have rights to like be able to have a grocery store that's servicing us and our community and the things that we eat that is culturally relevant? Do we have public spaces where we can convene? And so I think about all those things, and I think that place has so much to do with what makes a community, and how we sort of like partake in it, and all of the small businesses that exist within there tell so much of a story, not just the people themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that piece of like that bigger idea, right, of like what is the right to the city, being that it is both like that you have this right to have the city be a place of well-being, right? And what are all the characteristics of like something being for you as and in feeding your well-being, right? As that idea that then is beyond the kind of necessities and is actually like all of the ways in which people convene and the ways that people feel belonging, that's actually part of what we need to imagine our cities to be about and for. Is I think so central to all of this. Thank you so much for sharing all of those pieces. Appreciate it.
Does anyone else want to share anything? It's 8:45, so I want to be able to have time for you to sign books.
Sure.
Everyone's book signed.
We can leave it there.
All right. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you all for coming.